Welcome back everyone. In this video, I will be going through some of the key terminologies relating to the topic of genetics and inheritance. And this is just an introduction to prepare to the actual genetics that we're going to learn next lesson. And yeah, we're going to talk about how Chris Hemsworth comes into all this. The first two key terms that you need to understand and be able to distinguish between gene and alleles. So a gene, I think we've talked about genes in the past, but not in a lot of details. So this is the definition again. A gene is a sequence of DNA. So we've talked about DNA a lot in this topic. A gene is just a section of DNA that determines a characteristic, or we normally call it a trait of an organism. So if you think about DNA, so let's say this is the double, that's one strand and that's another strand of DNA. So if this is DNA, then a section of DNA, so let's just say if I change to red, so you can have a section of DNA. So this section, let's say this is a gene for eye color, for example. So a specific section in your DNA that codes for a specific trait, that is a gene. And within the same piece of DNA, you can have multiple genes. So you can have another one down here. Maybe this is a gene for hair color. I don't think those two genes are actually on the same DNA, but let's just assume that they are in this example. So a specific section of DNA is a gene, and most of the time the genes will code for a protein. So there's a protein that if you make that protein, you have this particular eye color. If you make another one, you have another eye color. Another way that you normally see gene being represented is in a chromosome. So let's say we have that's not very good drawing. So let's say we have a chromosome. So this, let's say that's the chromosome. Then normally, let me just label that first. Chromosome, you can have a gene in specific sections of the chromosome. So we can have, let's say this is the same gene for eye color is like here. So you have a gene here, and then on the same chromosome, you could have another gene for hair color. So it's just the specific sections of your DNA that codes for a specific trait or characteristic. And it doesn't have to be things that you can see. It could also be blood type or whether or not somebody can produce insulin. So people who are diabetics, that is a genetic condition. There's multiple ways to become a diabetics, and one of the ways that you're born with it is just your cell can't produce insulin. However, that normally is an autoimmune disease and not a genetic condition. Anyway, we won't go into too much details on that. So that's gene. The second term that you need to know is the term allele. Now, alleles are different forms of one gene. So you have a gene for eye color, but you can have multiple variations of hair color, and each of that, or eye color or hair color, each of that is called an allele. Different alleles usually only differ from each other by a few DNA bases, but that is enough to create the variation. So I have two examples here just to illustrate my point again. So you have a gene for eye color, but you can have 4 different alleles for brown, blue, emerald, or gray. And then you can have a gene for hair color, but you can have 4 different alleles. So these are the alleles. In the case of hair color, it could be blonde, red, brown, or black. So alleles are just variations of the same gene. Okay, so another term that you need to understand is the term genotype. So we'll talk alleles and genes, and now we have genotype. Now, a genotype is the set of alleles present in the DNA of an individual organism. So if you think about the idea of homologous chromosomes that we talked about when we discussed meiosis last lesson, you will always have 2 alleles for every gene because you have homologous chromosomes. So you inherit one chromosome from your father and the other one from your mother, which means that you're going to inherit one allele for the trait from your father and the other allele from your mother. So you always have 2 alleles for each trait. You would have 2 alleles for hair color, 2 alleles for eye color, for example. Most of the time. The exception, of course, is the Y chromosome, but we won't go into that in year 10. So, for example, this is the gene, and these are the alleles. But I could have my genotype, for example, because I had received one allele from my father and the other from my mother. But because I'm Asian, I think it's gray for both of them. So my genotype would be gray from my father and then gray from my mother. But you could also receive a brown. Some Asians have like brown black eyes. It's normally because one of the genotypes is brown. So you can have a brown genotype, sorry, a brown allele from one of your parents, and then let's say a gray from another. So these are some examples of the eye color genotype that an individual will have. So every genotype, with the exception of some of the X chromosome traits and Y chromosome traits, almost every genotype will contain two alleles, one from each parent. Now, this is actually not the way that we normally use to represent genotypes. We tend to use capital and lowercase letters to represent genotypes of an organism. So maybe I will go with, say, G in this case, and then instead of saying brown, it's lowercase g and then uppercase G, something like that. This is just to make it faster, and then we're going to go into this representation in a little bit more. So genotype is a pair of alleles, if you will. That's probably an easy way to define it. So let's talk about homozygous and heterozygous genotypes. So consider a gene which has two alleles, and I am going to use capital and lowercase letters to represent these alleles. So one allele I'm going to represent using capital letter A, and then the other allele is the lowercase letter a. So if you have two possible alleles, there are three different possible genotypes that can result from these two alleles. So you can have capital A, capital A. So let's say this is the locus or the location of the gene in a chromosome. So we're going to assume that the blue is capital A and the green is lowercase a. So you can have three different combinations here. You can have capital A, lowercase a, or both of the alleles are lowercase a. So just because you inherit one allele from each parent doesn't necessarily mean that the two alleles have to be different from each other. It really depends on the characteristic and what your parents have. Okay, so these two, this one and this one, these are called homozygous. So because obviously homo just means same. So if the two alleles of the genotype are identical to each other, then the individual is said to be homozygous for that gene. So this is homozygous. And this is also homozygous. So you have the same alleles for your genotype, then it is homozygous. So obviously capital A, lowercase a is going to be called heterozygous. Hetero just means different. So you think of homosexual and heterosexual, that's the same prefix, same or different. So this is heterozygous. It's when the two alleles of the genotype are different from each other. Okay, for that particular gene. So two terms, homozygous genotype versus heterozygous genotype. I'm going to give you another example. So let's say for blood types, there are three alleles that are available for blood types. We're going to call them capital I A, capital I B, and that's supposed to say lowercase I. So you have three different alleles. Now, if you have three different alleles, that increases the number of variations or the number of genotypes that you can have, because you can create a few different pairs with three alleles compared to two. So I can actually have these following 6 genotypes. So these three are homozygous because the two alleles of the genotype are identical to each other, and then you have these three which are heterozygous. So you and me and everyone has to have one of these 6 genotypes for blood type, depending on what you inherit from your parents. So that's the genotype. Now, once we have genotype, we're going to talk about another concept that's related, but it's not the same, which is phenotype. So genotype is your actual genetic makeup for a trait, which expressed in the combination of alleles that you have. Phenotype is the actual trait that you can see. The key thing here is that it's observable. So phenotype is the specific observable characteristics, or you can say trait, that can result from a genotype. So we go back to the example of blood type. If you have these 6 genotypes, they will translate to the following phenotype, which is your actual blood type. So this is actually very interesting. Notice how there are 2 possible genotypes that give you blood type A. So just because the genotypes are different doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result into a different phenotype. There are also 2 different genotypes that both give you blood type B. There's one for type O. So if you have blood type O, this is your genotype for sure. But if you're blood type A, there are 2 possible genotype combinations that you can have. And there's only one possible genotype for type AB. Now, type AB is really rare, whereas type O is actually the most common. I'm blood type O as well. So genotype is the actual allele combination. Phenotype is what you can see. So this is just to illustrate what I just said, that 2 different genotypes can give the same phenotype. And another point that is not shown in blood type, but in some other phenotypes, is that the phenotypes can change depending on the environment. Things like height, for example, definitely is not influenced by just genetics, also your diet and the way that you're brought up. Or even, I mean, skin color, like you can get more tanned if in summer, and that is influence of the environment. So phenotype, not every phenotype depends solely on the genotype. Blood type, obviously, you can't change your blood type regardless of what the environment is, but some other phenotypes you can. I'm going to give you another example of the differences between genotype and phenotype, and that is hair light. So there are 2 alleles for the gene for hairline, and we're going to use the capital letter H and the lowercase h to represent them. So if you only have 2 alleles for this gene, then there are 3 possible genotypes that can be formed from these 2 alleles. So you have both of them being capital H, both of them being lowercase h, or one is capital H and the other is lowercase h. Now, if you have this genotype, so this homozygous capital H or the heterozygous genotype, this is the phenotype that you're going to see. And this is where Chris Hemsworth comes in. This is called the widow's peak. I don't know whether any of you have heard of it. So widow's peak. And it's basically when there is a peak here in the hairline. I find this picture quite interesting because you can see that these are the Hemsworth brothers, and they all kind of have that widow's peak. So it's basically this part, even though you can kind of argue that Liam doesn't really have this. I kid you not, I Google other pictures of Liam Hemsworth just to double check whether or not he has a widow's peak yesterday. That was never thought I'd do that. However, if you have the homozygous lowercase genotype, then you're going to have a straight hairline. So this is a straight hairline, example, Tom Cruise. So the phenotype that you can see is straight hairline. So you either have widow's peak or straight hairline. Now, obviously, the level or how deep the peak is also varies between individuals as well. Which one do you have? I actually have a straight hairline, so that this would be my genotype. Okay. Now, this also provides an example of the differences between a dominant allele and a recessive allele, or dominant versus recessive phenotypes. And I think if you look at this, you can kind of tell that the widow's peak is going to be the dominant phenotype because there are more variations of genotypes that result in this phenotype compared to the straight hairline. So let's just define that. Once again, you have this genotype and then you have this phenotype. So H, the capital H, is considered the dominant allele because you only need one copy of this for the trait to be shown. Now, I didn't define this earlier, but the capital H would be the allele for widow's peak. Such a nice name, widow's peak. And the lowercase h is going to be the allele for straight hairline. So straight hairline. So H, the capital H is dominant because you only need one copy of it for the trait to be shown. And that's the definition of a dominant allele or dominant phenotype. And the lowercase h, the one for straight hairline, is going to be the recessive allele in this case because you can only see it if the individual possesses two copies of the allele. So if the individual is homozygous for that particular trait, that's the only way for it to be shown. So if something is dominant, you only need one copy of it for it to be shown. So it's going to be shown in the heterozygous individual. Whereas if an allele is recessive, it can only be shown if the individual is homozygous for that allele. Now, in general, the dominant allele is always represented using the capital letters. I didn't tell you the meaning behind capital versus lowercase letters earlier, but really we use them to distinguish between a dominant versus a recessive allele. So the dominant allele is always the capital letter, which we already represented here, and the recessive allele is going to be the lowercase letter. So let's go through this quick exercise, whether or not you can predict your genotype from your phenotype. And this is where you have to take into account whether the allele is dominant or recessive. Now, if an individual has a dominant phenotype, you know that the genotype must contain at least one copy of that allele, but it's impossible to know whether that person is homozygous or heterozygous for that particular gene. Because, for example, if you look at someone and they have widow's peak, I don't know whether their genotype will be homozygous, so capital H, or heterozygous, capital H, lowercase h. I cannot tell. I know they have to have one H in their genotype, but I don't know what the other genotype is going to be. Whereas if somebody has a recessive phenotype, so if somebody has a straight hairline, you know immediately that they must be homozygous for that trait, because that's the only way for the trait to be shown. So if someone has a dominant phenotype, and when you study genetics, you actually start with the phenotype. You start with what you can see, and then you work backwards and try to predict the person's genotype. Because genotype, it's very hard to sequence somebody's DNA. So normally we just look at someone and then we'll make predictions that way. So normally we work from phenotype backwards. This is why you need to understand how you can predict what kind of genotype somebody has from the phenotype that you can see. It doesn't have to be human as well. It could be animals, other animals, and plants. There's a lot of artificial selection, and we'll talk about this later next week, when, like, especially when you look at agriculture and you desire very specific phenotypes in the crops, and we basically want to know what genotype would give that phenotype, because, like, for example, you really want the carrots to be orange. That's a phenotype that you want. So the selective breeding is going to happen to ensure that you always get that phenotype, and you have to control the genotype of the carrots that way. I'm rambling again, so let's move on to the last slide. So we're going to do this. I'm going to do this, and then hopefully you can try yourself, and you can write that down in your notes. So let's see whether you can predict your own genotype from your phenotype. And we're going to look at a few traits. I'm going to do mine. Your will be different, I think. So this is the first trait, nearsighted. That's a nice name. So the dominant trait here is that you cannot see long distance, and the recessive trait is that you can see long distance. Sorry, the dominant phenotype is can't see long distance. Recessive is you can. Now my phenotype is nearsighted. So this is my phenotype, nearsighted. So because my phenotype is the dominant phenotype, I actually cannot predict exactly what my genotype is, but I know that it either big M or big M, little m. Everyone in my family is short-sighted, so I think that's an indication that it is a genetic condition. Okay, let's look at the second phenotype. Can you roll your tongue? I cannot, so I'm a non-roller. That's my phenotype. which means that my genotype must be small r, because the non-roller is a recessive allele. So the only way for the trait to be shown is if I have 2 copies of it. Okay, this one's always fun to do because you do have to clasp your hands. So if you clasp, you want to see whether your left thumb is on top or your right thumb is on top. I just did a clap then. My left thumb is on top, so that is my phenotype, left thumb on top. So if that is my phenotype, it means that it is a dominant phenotype. So my genotype must be either capital L, or capital L, small l. So I actually couldn't tell in this case what my genotype is. Okay, chin. So either you have a cleft chin or a smooth chin. I have a smooth chin. That sounds so weird to say it. So it will be lowercase c. So I am homozygous for this trait. Okay, we have 4 more. Earlobe. Now, this is whether or not you have free earlobe or attached. This is an example of free earlobe for anyone who doesn't know what that means. I have free earlobe. So that is the dominant trait, which means that I could either be homozygous or heterozygous. It's impossible to tell at this point. Dimples. I do have dimples. I have 1.5 dimples. You know, the funny thing is my dimples start to develop, like one of them's already there, but the other one only started developing when I get older. It's so creepy. But okay, I have dimples. This is the dominant trait, so I know I have at least 1 copy of this allele, but I don't know how many I have. So I could either be dominant or homozygous or heterozygous here. Hitchhiker's thumb. This is a hitchhiker's thumb. So your thumb bend backwards, which is a recessive trait. If it's dominant, it will be straight. And I never actually realized this about myself, but my thumb actually bend backwards. So this is a recessive phenotype, which means I must be homozygous for this trait. So this is the lower case, yeah? The last phenotype we're going to look at is the little finger. I don't think I have a photo for that. No. So if you just open your hands, you want to see whether your little finger is straight or bent. I think mine bends slightly. So that is a dominant trait, which means that either I am homozygous for that trait or heterozygous for that trait. So that's too much information about myself, but you can see whether you can do that for yourself, see whether you can go from the phenotype back to the genotype. That is it for today's lesson.